Here we go with our next unit, the Chemistry of Life unit. In this unit we'll be talking about water and the different elements that make up the living critter, and then how those elements combine and to form molecules and what those molecules do to help the organism survive, with the main molecules that we're looking at being carbohydrates, which are like sugars, things like that, lipids, so like fats, proteins, and nucleic acids, like DNA, and the blueprint of life. So let's begin with water. Water, you guys know, is a very, very important molecule. You know that you're mostly made up of water, that all things need water to survive, things like that. But why is water so important? What makes water so awesome? Well, basically, water is so important because of its chemical properties. Because water is what's called a polar molecule, which means that it's both slightly positive and slightly negative. And the reason for this, a little bit of chemistry, which you probably remember from last year, oxygen has 6 electrons in its outer shell. Hydrogen atoms each have 1, and you probably know that oxygen would like to have 8, as most elements would. Hydrogen would like to have 2, and when they hang out together and they share, everybody's happy. Hydrogen shares its 1, oxygen now has 8, hydrogen borrows some here, has 2, everyone's happy. Problem is, they don't really share equally. Oxygen is so much bigger that it pulls hydrogen's electrons and its own electrons a little bit closer to its nucleus. And because the electrons are negatively charged, the oxygen is slightly negative, and because these guys are losing a little bit of electrons, they're slightly positive. So what happens when negative charges get close to each other, or opposite charges get close to each other? Again, you probably remember this from last year, but opposite charges attract. And that weak attraction is called a hydrogen bond. So we see hydrogen bonding going on right here. We've got the slightly positive hydrogen bonding with the slightly negative oxygen. And this actually knits water together in this loose network, this loose framework, where you got lots of hydrogen bonds between all these different water molecules. So this allows water to do a lot of cool things. So the first thing being surface tension. You guys probably have heard of this before. Maybe you've seen pictures or seen in real life of organisms like this water strider walking on water, or spiders. Maybe you've seen that, or you've seen video like the Jesus lizard that can actually run on water for short distances. All that's because of the skin on the surface of the water. That's due to surface tension. It also allows for cohesion, where water sticks to itself. Right, so you can get water droplets like you see on this blade of grass down here. These water droplets kind of stick into each other. Probably a little bit of surface tension going on there too. And then you also get a little bit of adhesion, which is the cousin of cohesion, when water sticks to other things. These two things together are really important for things like pulling water up through a straw. Water sticks to itself and pulls more water up with it, but also sticks to the straw to keep it from falling back down. That becomes really important in plants because they're just basically filled with straws, pulling water up through. And then finally, water is also a really good solvent. It can dissolve lots of substances. It's often called the universal solvent, in fact, because it's slightly positive and slightly negative, so it can attract negative things and positive things. It makes it a really good solvent. So what is it that makes water so great? Well, we learned like some of the things that it can do. Obviously, we know about water being really, really good for hydration. But why is that? Because we talk about being a good solvent, it can dissolve lots of nutrients and materials that we need in our bodies. So this is the whole premise behind Gatorade and other sports drinks, right? They're full of electrolytes. You guys have probably heard that before, but maybe you don't even know what the heck an electrolyte is. Things like sodium, potassium, chlorine. These are all ions. These are all charged molecules. Things like sodium, right, has a charge, or chlorine, Cl minus, potassium has a positive charge. These are all things that your body needs, and they're dissolved within that water to make Gatorade, and you drink that and it carries it to your body. So hydration, obviously a big thing. Habitat, duh, right? Lots of things live in the water, fish especially, but there's a lot of aquatic insects, a lot of aquatic plants, not to mention bacteria and tons of other things. Another really, really interesting thing about water is that it modifies the climate very, very well. Again, because it's a polar molecule and those molecules are attracted to each other, it takes a lot of energy to change water's temperature. And as an example of this, just think of our climate here in Oregon. Right now it might be pretty warm here in Dallas, or like look at this weather map down here. In the valley, this is very, very warm. This is in the middle of summer, like in July I think I took this. So 90s over here, and what is it on the coast? 64. Why? Because it's close to the ocean. That Pacific water is very, very cold. That cools off the air currents coming over. So it's pretty much always cooler over here in the summertime, and then in the wintertime you'll have the reverse, where it'll be a little bit warmer over on that side. And then, of course, water is also pretty good because it provides extra habitat because it floats. Water is actually less dense than liquid water, which may seem like something we can take for granted, but for example, dry ice, which is frozen carbon dioxide, sinks, but frozen water floats, and that's a really good thing. So not least of all, it provides habitat, right? So things like polar bears and seals and things like that, other stuff that live under the ice and eat algae that grow on the ice, obviously that's really important. But if ice sunk, think of what would happen to a pond or a lake. The top layer would freeze and sink, and then more would freeze and sink, and so on and so forth until that pond or that lake were frozen solid, and that obviously wouldn't be very good for life. As it is, that ice floats, provides a little bit of an insulation so that the water underneath the ice doesn't sink. Very important, especially if you live underwater.